Not to sell short the literary works of great horror writers like Edgar Allan Poe, Bram Stoker, and Washington Irving, I think there's no denying that the absolute king of horror is Stephen King himself. No one else has really ever been able to just create such a huge magnitude of horror stories that just resonated with society so much as Stephen King. This guy is like a horror story machine. So many of the modern classic horror films that everyone knows and loves are based on the works of Stephen King. Stephen King being my favorite author is not exactly the most unique take of all time, but he is, without a doubt, my favorite author I have ever read. And I figured it was time I did a video about him. So I wanted to touch upon the films based on Stephen King. There seems to be a very popular opinion that most Stephen King movies suck, and I don't actually agree with that. I think there's a lot of good ones, and I think most people, if they were to really stop and think about it, wouldn't agree with that statement either, because there are just so many Stephen King films that people love, and so many that I think people should love that they don't. So I want to go through my top 10 favorite films based on Stephen King's work. Now, just to set some criteria for this list, I will only be doing horror movies. So even though there are some films that are not horror movies or entirely horror movies based on Stephen King's work that are very good, like The Shawshank Redemption, The Green Mile, and my absolute favorite of the three, Stand By Me, based on the novella The Body from different seasons, they won't be making the cut just because I'm doing horror only because, Halloween season's upon us. So I will just say that all three of those movies probably would have made the list had they been allowed, and Stand By Me probably would have been in my top 3 or 5 at least if it was able to make the cut. But without any further ado, let's jump in. So for my number 10 spot, I'm going with the one I think is the most fun, which is Thinner, but there was actually 3 extremely close competitors for this slot. One was Gerald's Game, which is a more recent one that was exclusive to Netflix, and the other is the anthology film Cat's Eye, where there's 3 mini horror stories linked together with the escapades of a stray cat, and the first 2 in there are based on Stephen King's short stories Quitters Inc. and The Ledge. Both great short stories, and I don't think the movie is particularly amazing in any way. I do think it's solid, but I would say it's the most faithful adaptations of King's short stories into film I've ever seen. When I watched that for the first time, which was, probably almost a decade ago now, it was after I had already read the stories, and when I watched what they had put to film, it looked exactly like what I was picturing when I was reading the stories. So even though I won't always judge that for the criteria that it has to be like the book to be good, that's not my standards at all. I think if they are able to do that very well, that's still very impressive. So I would put it high for that. The third story in it with the little troll thing is not based on anything that Stephen King wrote, so it's just kind of an original story. The whole movie's a pretty fun little package. There's definitely some things I don't like about the movie very much, hence why it didn't make the cut here, but I think it's worth a watch. Gerald's Game was very good, especially considering how limited the story is, as it takes place in one location with a character who is not able to move because they are chained up. I thought it was very well done, extremely well done. There's one part that's very hard to watch where she's trying to rip her hand loose of the handcuffs. It is extremely difficult to watch. I winced so hard when I was watching it, but it's a great movie. It just didn't make the cut though, even though I would say it's a better made altogether film than Thinner. I just wouldn't want to watch it as often as Thinner. I have heard a lot of people crap on the movie version of Thinner, one of the Richard Bachman books, but they always seem to say, oh, it's too cheesy, it's too campy, it's silly and comic booky and cartoonish and over the top. And I always just have to think when they say that, did we read the same book? The book is extremely cheesy and over the top, and I think they captured the silly and cynical mood of the book really well. Our main character in Thinner is a detestable ass. You are not supposed to like that guy. There's really no one likable in the story, and we're just kind of in his head. And I think the movie does a great job of what King did in the book, of despite him being a horrible character that we love to hate, we also kind of see the humanity of him and find ourselves rooting for him at times in the story, regardless of how bad he can be at other times. I think the stylistic choice they went for was to make it feel like a comic book come to life, a classic horror comic like Tales from the Crypt. And that's exactly what it feels like. It feels like an episode of Tales from the Crypt. A lot of the exaggerated camera angles and dramatic music cues and over-the-top acting and facial expressions they make. It's very cartoony. It's very much like Creepshow in that it is glorifying old, campy horror comics. And I think it's a perfect parallel to that in film. If you go into this movie expecting that, I think you're going to have a really good time. If you're going into this movie for some reason expecting something like the level of Shawshank Redemption or something, you're going to be sorely disappointed. I guess I should just also clarify right here before we move on to my number 9 spot that Creepshow, despite being a Stephen King film, is not on this list because it's not based on an actual book of Stephen King's. So even though Creepshow is amazing, it's not going to go on this list. Most people would probably put this one higher on the list, but I think it's not quite as good as some of the other ones I love. But I mean, hey, just the fact that it's in my top 10 shows how good it is, in my opinion. Pet Sematary is a lot of fun. It's definitely unsettling also. I wouldn't say it's all fun. There's definitely a lot of unsettling content in this movie. It deals with some pretty messed up ideas. But with that rockin' tune by the Ramones, and even Sheena Was a Punk Rocker slipping in there, Herman Munster giving a great performance and all, it's definitely got its fun factor too. I think the thing I find so interesting about this movie is it's kind of a really dark metaphor for letting go of loss, accepting loss, moving on, dealing with grief. Because in the film, the main character literally finds a way to bring people back from the dead. And while that is a very specific concept, it can be applied to many different things. And in here, when you bring them back to life, it's like, okay, well, you brought the physical thing, the physical object that you connect in your brain with this person back, but the spirit isn't there. The actual core of who this person was is gone. And it just kind of shows what we identify things as, physical things. We identify everything as physical, but that's not really what things are. And it's not until we actually accept that the real thing is gone that we can let go of the physical as well. And it's a really suspenseful and disturbing movie. It's not the most disturbing, definitely, with, the types of horror films that have come out since then. But I don't think it needs to be, super gory or anything to be disturbing. It has some gore, the Achilles heel slash part is pretty hard to watch, but it's not so much a gore flick as it's just disturbing in the subject matter it deals with, and having to imagine not only dealing with the loss of your own child, but then that child coming back with something else living within its body, and your child is not actually there. And then having to actually turn on what looks like your child. It's basically the zombie cliche, but I think it's handled in a much more personal and interesting way, rather than it just being a survival pick of, oh, there's zombies everywhere, how will we survive? It's more just, what if just in this one isolated little incident, someone you loved became a zombie? And I think it's a great zombie flick all around just for that. They made a remake of Pet Sematary in recent years, and while it wasn't terrible, it was completely unnecessary, and it basically told the audience that it only exists because the original exists. When we see the little boy running into the street about to die, and we think it's that part, like, okay, the little boy's gonna die, The little boy gets saved, but the little girl dies. We changed the child. Now it's a girl zombie and not a boy zombie. And the ending is different, but it really is just like, it is trying to subvert your expectations for what you saw in the original film version. And it just seems like, why does this exist? You made a mediocre remake of a classic beloved film and just switch something for the sake of being able to say, you weren't expecting that? Can't beat the original. Speaking of ones that are faithful to the book, I think The Mist is very spot on with the novella. Obviously, there's things changed about it, most notably the ending, which I'll get to in a second, but it's a very good one-to-one recreation of the novella, which can be found in Skeleton Crew. This is another case where when watching it, it looks so much like what I was actually imagining when reading the book. When I read, I know most people get this, some people I have talked to do not, but I very much 100% visualize what I'm reading. I'll start creating in my head what the room looks like, what the lighting looks like, what the characters look like, what time of day it is and everything. Like, I will fully paint a picture in my head of what I think what I'm reading looks like. And a lot of times when I see a movie, it does not at all look like what I was picturing, but in this one, it just happened to. And it's great. Some of the acting is a little underwhelming. Some of the special effects aren't very convincing, but the creature designs are amazing, especially the, giant Goliath thing crawling around in the fog near the end. But The Mist is just, again, a very disturbing movie when it comes to, well, once again, father and child. The characters in The Mist are all done pretty perfectly. They're pretty spot on to how they are in the novella. Again, some of the acting is a little weak, but I don't think the acting is bad. I wouldn't say it's bad. I think our main character, he comes off a little weak when he's just trying to talk to other people, but when he does his emotional scenes, I think he does a really good job. And spoiler alert if you don't want to be spoiled, but the ending of the movie is very different from the ending of the book. And while it is way more depressing, I think it's a way better ending. And I think it's way more impactful and memorable. In that, in the book, it ends on a hopeful note where the team kind of just gets to, I believe it's like an empty hotel or whatever. Through the mist, they drive through the mist, find this hotel, and they're able to hear on the radio that there are other people. It ends with hope, like, okay, there are other people out there. There's still hope in the movie ending, but it teaches a valuable lesson in that they're driving through the mist, this few survivors, the father, his son, and the other survivors in the car. And they run out of gas. They realize there's nowhere they can go. They're going to get killed by these monsters in the mist. And the father just decides we need to shoot ourselves with, we have just enough bullets in here. Let's just shoot ourselves so we don't get killed by the monsters and we can just die together. And they all kill themselves. The father has to shoot his own son. And then just as he's about to shoot himself, the military shows up and rescues them, and it turns out if he had just waited 1 minute longer, he wouldn't have had to have murdered his own son. And that is heartbreaking, but it's a good message that no matter how horrible things get, don't give up. There's always hope. There's always a chance. Never give up. Never throw in the towel. Like there's always something you can do. And it's heart-wrenching, but I think it's a good message. Whereas I feel the original novella, the ending doesn't really leave you with any feeling. You're just kind of like, oh, it's nice that there's hope, but whatever. So I think the movie, while it's an insanely depressing ending, it is a much better ending than that of the novella. But overall, I think it's a very good representation of what the novella was like, and it's just, again, fun is a weird word, but it is a lot of fun. It is definitely worth a watch. Misery is probably one of the most highly rated Stephen King movies. This movie was a big deal. And I think it's mostly because of Kathy Bates. People really were blown away by the performance of Kathy Bates in this movie. And while I do think she is really good, she plays a perfect spot on Annie, exactly how she was in the book, I do think the actor playing Paul Sheldon is actually even better, because he doesn't say much. He doesn't really get to actually say much in the movie. And when he is talking, he's, BSing for Annie to try to stay on her good side. He's hiding himself. But there's something about his expressions, his facial expressions, his body language, his emotional responses that are so strong that I think he's doing so much with so little in this movie. And I also just think there's a really strong comedic air to this film. And I know most people wouldn't consider it a comedy. Most people would consider this movie very scary. I find this movie to be very darkly humorous. I think because we're with Paul Sheldon in this experience, and he's badly hurt. He was kidnapped, essentially rescued, quote unquote, but kidnapped by his fan Annie, crazed fan obsessed with his misery novels, who pretends she's nursing him back to health, but is really just keeping him prisoner in her house. And she's forcing him to write a final misery book where he brings the character back from the dead and everything, because she couldn't believe that he killed off the character and all. And he's just stuck here. He might be stuck here forever. He doesn't know how he's going to get out. And he just has to write this story, and he has to pretend to like this woman who acts very sweet, but she's crazy, and she has moments of just acting like a complete maniac. So yeah, we're with him in that situation. We're seeing it through his eyes. And much like the book, when you're in someone's head like that, they're not going to be panicked, scared, horror movie mode all the time. At some point, your brain is going to realize this is the situation you're in. Sadly, that's going to become normal after a bit, and you're going to have kind of a comedic and satirical outlook on everything. And I think the way he kind of cracks little jokes making fun of Annie that she doesn't pick up on is pretty hilarious. He's almost like Groucho Marx or Chevy Chase, where they're just constantly roasting everybody around them, but it's just going over everyone's heads because they're just busting out these quick quips and they know they're sharper than the people around them. Also, I feel there's a lot of comedy with the police in this movie, and even with Annie, her portrayal is very hammy and over the top. And everyone kind of has this like layer of comedy to them that I think the movie doesn't get enough credit for. I think the movie's actually really funny. I'd say the only thing that's probably lost in this movie from the book is there's just certain things you can't convey in a movie that you can in a book, where you can get whole chapters just written in Paul's mind, and we're in the character's mind, and he's just thinking about society again, thinking about how he wants to listen to rock and roll again for the first time in forever. He's like dying just to hear Cyndi Lauper. You don't get that added human element in movies, because you can't just have a scene showing Paul just laying in bed and having a narrator just tell you all these things. It's not the same effect. So they did a good job with what they had, but unfortunately, just with the, style of the medium, you can't get as into Paul's head as you can in the book. But I think they still do a great job at making us feel for Paul and really humanizing him and making him a likable guy going through a horrible, horrible situation. They do their best to imply things, like we see Paul lifting the typewriter a lot, trying to get his upper body strength up secretly from Annie. And I don't know if someone who hasn't read the book would know what's going on in those scenes. I had read it prior to seeing the movie, so when I saw the movie, I'm like, oh, they're putting that part in. But they don't explain it in the movie, so some people might not get why he's lifting up a typewriter every now and then in the movie. But overall, great movie, very suspenseful. The scenes where he's like creeping around the house in his wheelchair when Annie's out are nail biting. They're amazing. Super good suspense, super good settings, super good character acting. Everything is great in this movie. Definitely check it out. Alright, so I don't really consider this one a horror movie. I guess you could say it is horrific, but I think of it more as a kind of a comedic action sci-fi thriller. It's really just a dystopian Arnold Schwarzenegger film. I initially debated not including it in the list, but I like it so much that I figured, what the hell, let's throw The Running Man in there. And here's one that is nothing like the book. This is one that's very, very different from the source material. Same general idea, but the way the game show works is completely different. They're not just out in the world and everyone is trying to spot them. The stalkers are not just expert snipers and stuff and assassins. They're these over-the-top, gaudy, cartoon character, WWE gimmick kind of guys. It's very different. And the main character is not an average Joe. He's a gigantic, humongous, muscle-bound, special ops guy who's cracking one-liners and spines. So it's very different from the book, but it gets that same kind of bitter, satirical edge that the book has, kind of just dumping on, the entertainment industry and big corporations and all. And it really comes off like something almost like RoboCop or Starship Troopers, where it is very much just making fun of everything in the entertainment industry and everything in society and kind of exposing us for being disgusting, soulless consumers. It's a lot of fun, though. It sounds really dark, but it is a really goofy, stupid, funny movie when you watch it. The stalkers are so over the top. We got Sub-Zero, who's dressed like a hockey player. We have Buzzsaw, who's covered in chainsaws and blades and everything. We have the opera-singing, electric-powered Dynamo, and we even have Jesse the Body Ventura. We have so many random, weird, crazy characters in this movie. The game show is just done so well as just this really dark, disturbing version of game shows like The Price is Right and stuff. It gets played up like it's a game show just like The Price is Right or Family Feud, but what's actually happening is people cheering for what are believed to be criminals, but usually, they were framed, being stalked and murdered by these professional assassins, more or less, and they just make a big fun game out of it. I think a lot of modern sci-fi literature has come from it. I think definitely The Hunger Games pulled from The Running Man a lot. And yes, the movie is much cornier and much more lighthearted, even though it's very violent. It is much more lighthearted than the book. The book is dark. I do think it is a really good movie version of it. Even though it's very different, I do think it is very good as a film because it's extremely entertaining. I don't know if the book would have been as entertaining if it was a one-to-one remake into a movie. So I do think, even though it's very different, Running Man is great. It's a ton of fun. You will laugh your ass off watching this movie. And Schwarzenegger he's great as always. Arnold Schwarzenegger is always good, especially 80s Arnold Schwarzenegger, one-liner Arnold Schwarzenegger, kills a guy, cracks a line about how he died. You can't go wrong with that. So, yes, definitely check out The Running Man. All right, we're in the top 5 now. Now, this one is actually a story I'd never read, even though I own it. I did get the book back when I was on my big Stephen King kick in my early 20s. I was just going through everything he wrote in the 70s and 80s at that time. And I bought it, but I never read it because, I had seen imagery from the movie before, like the car on fire and everything. But for some reason, I was just always like, at that time, that this is too silly. I can't get into a car that kills people. This premise is too stupid. I just can't. But then, a few years after that, I saw the movie Christine finally, and the movie is amazing. I probably have some bias because John Carpenter is my favorite director, especially like 80s John Carpenter. Like, how do you go wrong with 80s John Carpenter? So yes, he made my favorite horror movie of all time, Halloween. He made Big Trouble in Little China, They Live, the remake of The Thing, Escape from New York, Prince of Darkness, The Fog. He made so many good movies in the 80s, and even ones that I'm not like a humongous fan of that aren't horror, like Starman, are still great movies, honestly. I really think he couldn't do wrong at that time. Anything John Carpenter made was amazing, and Christine is no exception. I definitely love the Americana angle, where Christine is this old 50s car, and there's just so many old 50s rock and roll songs and stuff playing on the radio in the car and everything. And I feel like Stephen King is kind of always at his best when he's reminiscing about the 50s and 60s. You can tell he has a large affinity for that time in his life, being a child in the 1950s, that when he puts that in his books, it just seems like there's a lot of love in there. So it works really well in the movie and definitely adds a ton of extra charm. There's some really cool scenes in the movie. I think one of the most impressive ones is when the car is smashed to pieces by people who hate our main character. And then he just somehow knows Christine can fix herself and just tells her to do that. And then we see all these reverse shots of dents being popped out and Christine just forming back into a whole car again. And it's incredible. Every time I watch it, I know it's reverse footage, but it's just, there's so many parts where it's like, how did they do that? And it just looks so cool. The green light glowing in the car when it's, killing the girl and it's playing. You keep a knocking, but you can't come in. Like, it's just, there's so many really cool scenes in this movie. It's just one that sticks out in my mind all the time. Like, I can't put my finger on why I like it as much as I do, but it's just such a well-made movie. The main character can be such a jackass at times in the movie, especially as he's getting more and more corrupted by the car. But we're also with him. He's also a guy that we can see things from his angle and his perspective, and you like him even when he's being a piece of crap. It's like you still want to see things work out for him. It's a great movie. I definitely would recommend this one. Number 4 is It Chapter 1. Now, I know the movie's technically just called It, but I have to call it It Chapter 1 because they then made a sequel called It Chapter 2, and I did not think that was anywhere near as good as It Chapter 1, so I don't want anyone to get confused thinking that that movie is clumped in with this one. I recall the original 1990 TV movie being a big deal for kids my generation. We kind of all just watched it as kids. At some point, everyone has that story that at a sleepover, they ended up watching it. And a lot of us, it scared us. For me, I found it more funny as a kid than I did scary, but I loved it. And for years, I loved it. I remember when I was younger, just always hearing about, Freddy this and Jason that. And, I loved them. But I remember always bringing up Pennywise. And a lot of people were like, who? Or they would be like, oh, yeah, I think I remember seeing that. That was that clown movie when we were kids. But then at some point, it blew up. And now it is definitely the Stephen King franchise. Everyone knows and loves it. It's definitely his most popular now. And I think it always was very popular, but it definitely seems like it got a boost in popularity very close to when this movie came out. It was also the first Stephen King book I ever read, so needless to say, it was a very important story for me. I like it a lot. I think it's a great story. It's just one I've always enjoyed ever since I was a kid. So going into this movie, I had pretty high standards. I was like, I don't know if I'm going to like this. I'm going to be very picky about this. And I have to say, even though it took me about 5 minutes to get over the whole, though, that's not Georgie, that's not Bill, being, being a jerk about it. Very quickly, I just gave myself to the movie and got into it and was just like, this is fantastic. This is a great interpretation of the novel. It's very different in some ways, but it's also very close to the novel in a lot of ways. I think while Pennywise, the creepiness of Pennywise and everything is very important, most people say it's the most integral part of the whole story. I would say just as important, if not more important, is the bond of the Losers Club, the main 7 kids and their friendship and how close they are. When you read or watch an iteration of it, you want to feel like you want to be these kids' friends. Like, when you want to be like, wow, I wish when I was a kid, I knew these kids and, played in the woods with them and everything. And I think they did a great job with that in this movie. The kinship between the children is so strong. And they're very realistic, the way they all roast each other all the time. They're constantly making fun of each other in silly, immature ways. And there's just something very contagiously fun about what they're doing. And, certain ones have certain secrets with each other and certain jokes with each other and all. And they're all just like a little family. And I think that's very important to the story. You want to feel like the Losers Club is super close, because the only reason they're able to beat it in the actual grand scheme of things is because of that bond, that together they're stronger, together they don't have any fear. And that's just really well done in this movie. But that being said, Bill Skarsgård as Pennywise is really damn good. I've heard that he didn't watch Tim Curry's ever before making this movie, and didn't even when he got the job until after the film was being made, because he didn't want at all to be affected by that performance. He didn't want to mimic that performance in any way. He wanted to just do his own thing, and he really did. His Pennywise is completely different from Tim Curry's. And it's really good. He's extremely creepy. He's got that big light bulb shaped head and the eyes going in opposite directions and the drool and the teeth and everything. And he's an extremely good Pennywise. A lot of the scares are really good in the movie. When he's transforming into everyone's fears. They did a lot of really creative fears. There was times in the theater when I was watching it where I physically jumped out of my seat, like when the projector is going on and you keep seeing Pennywise show up with every picture going by in the projector, and you think that's the scare at first, and then without any warning he's just in the room and he's gigantic, and that just shocked the hell out of me when I saw it in theaters the first time. There's definitely some great stuff. The lady from the painting that Stan Uris keeps seeing is very creepy. There was some good stuff in there. They definitely did a great job with the scares. I'm usually not a huge fan of super CG heavy horror movies where the scares are just a bunch of CG crap, but they did a really good job with the CG in these movies. And Derry is very well realized. It feels like a real town. It feels lived in and everything. It feels like these kids have been living in it for a while. I would say I have 2 big complaints. One is I think the character of Mike Hanlon is severely underutilized in this film. They kind of try to make up for that in the sequel, but just talking about this film on its own, Mike is really reduced down to almost nothing in this film. And in the book, everyone says Bill Denborough is the main character, but I honestly have always felt like you could make an argument that Mike Hanlon is actually the main character, because a huge portion of the novel is just through the eyes of Mike. Every now and then you get a journal entry from him talking about his family's history with the town and stuff, and just him talking about history in the town in general. And there's all these segments that never make it into the movies of Mike Hanlon with the bird and everything when he's a kid, and there's so much to Mike. He's the one essentially who stays behind and metaphorically keeps the light on in the lighthouse for the other kids, that when they grow up, when it comes back, he can contact them and come back for the promise that they all made, that if it ever comes back, they will get together again and destroy it. The original movie definitely did a better job of keeping Mike as a major character. They definitely made Bill the main character, but they did a pretty good job of making Mike an almost equally big character. They kind of screwed up near the end, but he's very present in that story. But in this movie, he's clearly the odd man out. He's barely in. He doesn't even have that much dialogue in the movie. And Despite what I said about the Losers Club seeming so close, he never seems as close with them as they seem to each other. It definitely feels like he's just like the other guy. If anything, they kind of just make him the muscle. Like, he beats up Henry Bowers when they're in the sewers at the end, and he brings like the hydraulic gun thing from the farm, and that's really it. Like, he doesn't do anything else in the movie, and they took his major character trait of him being the historian, him being the one who researches the town and all of the happenings in the past that led to this, and they gave that all to Ben. And now Ben does that. I understand that Ben always loved being in the library in the novel, but Ben wanted to be an architect. And just because he was in the library doesn't mean you have to make him the only researcher. I guess that was their excuse for putting in the library scenes for Ben. But it kind of makes it so that Mike has nothing to do. And Ben tells them all this stuff before Mike even joins their, like, you know, their gang. So Mike is really just like out of the loop in this movie, and he really has nothing to do. And I think that's kind of a shame. The other thing that bothers me, it loses something not being set in the late 50s. The original story was the late 50s as the child timeline, and the 80s as the adult timeline. And, you know, the 1990 movie moved that up a little bit, where I think it's like 59-60 as kids, and then like, you know, 89-90 as adults. But in this one, it's the late 80s. It is like 1989, 1990 when they're kids, and then the 2010s, the late 2010s when they're adults. And I can understand wanting to modernize it. I can definitely get why they would do that. They wanted it to be something that could appeal to everyone, and period pieces might not appeal to that young teenage audience you're trying to get. But I think there is something to be said about that, because, I mean, look at how popular Stranger Things is with teenage audiences. I don't think making it a period piece would have lost anything. I think it actually works better, too, in horror movies to be set in the era before cell phones and smartphones and all that. But, yeah, there's just the fact that it takes place in the 80s. And don't get me wrong, I'm an 80s baby. I love the 80s, but, like, it's so overdone in Hollywood now. It just becomes such a trend to just make everything 80s themed. I don't think it really brings anything to the movie. I think you kind of lose some of that Americana innocence that the original one has, being set in the 50s when you put it in the 80s. I don't know, again, like I said earlier, I think Stephen King is just, he clearly has a huge love for the 1950s, and especially being a child in the 1950s. So when he writes stuff like The Body and Sometimes They Come Back, he really injects a lot of that love for that time period into that. And I think The Body and It are the two pieces he has that just, he really put all of that into there. And you can really feel the love for that time period in his writing. But also the 1950s are kind of always seen as this clean-cut, straight edge, you know, keeping up with appearances kind of time period, where like you always had to have a smile on and everything was very wholesome. So putting something horrible and dark like Pennywise in there, and then even like the parents having to ignore it and pretending it's not even happening, is, I guess, like kind of like a little reflection of what Stephen King felt like in the time. But this movie, you really lose all of that. And the 80s, it's just like, oh, look, we got a bunch of 80s references because the 80s, everyone loves the 80s. And then the modern one is just, you know, that's the next movie. I'm not going to talk about it, but I think you do lose a lot. I mean, there's something to be said, too, for, like, they didn't mix it very well. The original novel and TV movie, they constantly jump between being adults and kids randomly. Whereas in these movies, the first one is all kids, and then the next one is suddenly these new adult actors that don't even feel like the same characters. And it has a disconnect, I think, when you do that. If they blended it a little better, it wouldn't have felt so jarring. But aside from that, I'd still call it a masterpiece. I still think it's really, really damn good. It's very creepy, and there's no denying its humongous impact it's had on pop culture since it came out. Pennywise has really just become one of the biggest horror icons since this movie came out. I'd like to re-watch Chapter 2 at some point, because I still only saw it in theaters when it was new. I've never seen it since then. but I remember not being wild about it. But definitely, if anything, check out Chapter 1. Of course, this movie was going to be on the list. I think for most people, this would be the number 1 spot. I love this movie. Obviously, it's number 3 for me, but there are still some movies I enjoy more than The Shining. I almost feel stupid having this segment because, like, what am I going to say about this movie that other people haven't already said? There's literally YouTube channels dedicated to just analyzing this one film. Like, The Shining is just considered one of the greatest, not even horror movies, one of the greatest movies of all time. Definitely Kubrick is one of those directors that people do love to blow rainbows up, his southern regions, but, there's no denying he had a very strong artistic vision for things. There could be cases where people are seeing symbolism where there isn't, and it could just be, him putting weird imagery to films just for the sake of making it come off deep, or maybe it was a complete genius and everything in his movies was just intentionally put there for a specific reason. But regardless, all of that aside, whether you want an extremely intellectual discussion point kind of movie that you can just sit around and analyze with people, or if you want a really darn creepy and exciting, fun, suspenseful horror film that's going to entertain the hell out of you, The Shining scratches both of those itches perfectly. I think a lot of it comes down to the performances. Obviously, Jack Nicholson is amazing. He is hamming it up like crazy, much like Kathy Bates hammed it up as Annie. Jack Torrance is an absolute nutcase. He seems extremely dangerous and creepy right from the start of the movie. And Shelley Duvall is amazing as Wendy. I know there's a lot of news out there saying that, things Kubrick did to her on the set to get her scared and panicky all the time were a little unethical. He treated her a little badly just to get her acting, as crazy as she was acting. That is not cool at all, but the movie is really damn good. I don't think anyone can deny that. And Shelley Duvall is a big contributor to why that movie is so good. It's definitely one of those types of movies that puts you in a different mindset, almost like a lot of the old silent films like Nosferatu and Haxan and stuff like that, where you're just kind of in this weird dream state. You almost feel like you're in a nightmare and you're just at the mercy of it, and you can't really tell what's real, what's actually going on, but you don't really care. You're kind of just drifting along through it, sort of like the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. You're just at the mercy of this film, and you almost feel like you're going insane watching it. And I think The Shining does that extremely well. It's very claustrophobic despite taking place in an enormous setting. It just, it's cabin fever to like a millionth degree. And it's interesting because you can, look at the movie from multiple ways. It could be about a family just going crazy in a hotel by themselves in the winter, or it could be that the hotel is actually haunted and there's really ghosts there and horrible things did happen. I'd say when you watch the movie, it's pretty obvious that it's both. Both things are happening. For instance, if there were no ghosts, then who the hell let Jack out of the freezer? So I definitely think there is a supernatural element, and I do think everyone's going crazy. So I think both perspectives are worthy of being warranted. There are some things from the book that are better. I do think the cook character is wasted just for a shock moment, whereas in the book, he's kind of the main hero of the story. But for the most part, the movie is way better than the book, and the book's okay. And I know Stephen King has always been a little bitter about that, that the movie is so much more well-regarded than his book is. And I can understand that frustration as a creator, that it must be annoying that everyone tells you your own invention isn't as good as someone else's version of your own invention. But sometimes other people just do things better, and I think the book was more or less a stepping stone to get to this film. right, number 2. This movie breaks my heart. Carrie, played by Sissy Spacek, Carrie White, is the most lovable girl. You feel so bad for her. That's the whole point of the movie, is you're supposed to feel sorry for her. Yes, what she can do is scary. Yes, what she does is scary. But we see how she gets there. We see the injustice of the world, and we can all relate to it in some way. Whether you feel like you are Carrie, or if you feel like, damn, maybe I'm one of these people doing this to Carrie. I better change who I am, because this is terrible. It's definitely a very human film, and I think Sissy Spacek's performance makes the film. Like, everyone's pretty good in it, but Sissy Spacek makes the movie. I would say her mother is the second greatest portrayal of a character in the film, but there's something about Sissy Spacek's portrayal of Carrie that's just... It's exactly what we needed. Yes, she's shy, she's awkward, she's a little weird, but she's so lovable. She's such a nice, sweet person. She's so innocent. We can connect with her. You can feel how she just wants to be normal, and just no one will accept her. And I know some people have complained that Sissy Spacek is not an accurate physical representation of what Carrie was described to be in the book. They say that she's too pretty. I think that's kind of silly to say that. I mean, Sissy Spacek is not an unattractive woman at all, but, you know, she's not the conventional Hollywood attractive where you look like a Barbie doll. But in the book it says that she's a little overweight, she's chubby, and she has acne. And no, Sissy Spacek is not either of those things. But King does also say later, when she's at prom, in the prom dress and everything, that she really is a beautiful girl. She really is a pretty girl. And she just isn't noticed as a pretty girl normally, because she doesn't dress the way girls are told they're supposed to. She doesn't wear her hair the way the other girls say they're supposed to. She doesn't wear makeup the way other girls say they're supposed to. She doesn't fit that mold of what, like, high school says is attractive. And you remember when you're in high school, you're the most shallow person in the world. Everyone's standards are unrealistically high in high school. So I think Sissy Spacek fits that really well. Like, no, she doesn't look like what is, conventionally considered extremely hot in high school, but she is a really pretty cute girl when you actually look at her. And I think that's perfectly portrayed with Sissy Spacek's performance. Carrie is probably one of the greatest tragedies of all time. And this is definitely a case where I think the movie excels over the novel. I love the novel, don't get me wrong, but I think Stephen King just goes too far sometimes, where he wants to make his stories so big and bombastic, he ends up actually slowing it down. For instance, during the infamous prom night, in the book, there's a whole chapter in the middle of while all the chaos is happening, where it just cuts to King describing some random guy, like, Bob used to hang out at the police station a lot, and it's like, whoa, who the hell is this guy? I want to know what's going on at prom night. And he starts, like, giving his account of, like, oh yeah, I saw the girl. It's like the next day, and he's like, yeah, I saw the girl walking around covered in blood, and so on and so forth. And it just hits the brakes for like 20 pages, 10 pages, and wastes your time with this crap. And it just, I know he's trying to make it seem like this giant event, like everyone's talking about it for days to come, weeks to months, years to come. But I think it just slows down the action so much, and the movie doesn't waste any time. There's no filler in this film. The thing about this movie is it has such a lovable main character, and you want so badly to help her. You just want to give her a hug. You just want to hug Carrie and tell her everything's fine. Not everyone hates you. This is just a horrible place. You have a horrible mother and a horrible school, but trust me, things will get better. You just want her to feel loved, and they pull that off so well in the movie. And that's one of the reasons why I think the movie works so well, is that you just feel so bad for her. The pain you feel for Carrie is so personal. It just, like, it hits your soul. And I think that's just The reason why I love this one so much more than almost any other Stephen King adaptation, it's so close to being my favorite. I'd consider it probably one of my favorite horror movies of all time. If I was going to do a top 20 or maybe even top 10 horror films of all time, it would probably be on that list. Because I just think, while it's not the scariest horror film, it is a horror film, and it's such an emotional, powerful film. And a lot of that is due to Sissy Spacek. I think Sissy Spacek can't be honored enough when talking about this movie. She had so much to do with why this movie was amazing. It's one of the ones I saw at a younger age, sort of like The Shining. I saw it as probably a preteen first, and it's just always had a strong connection with me. I always loved it. But you love it not in the sense that it's fun. You love it in that you love the story it tells, you love the character, and you love the fact that it exists and that injustices like this are exposed. But, you know, a lot of people, I guess, do also just view it as a badass revenge story, that the underdog has superpowers, and, you know, what if the person that everyone teased and made fun of actually had superpowers and could kill everybody? And I think that's something that everyone felt, as someone, you know, who got bullied a lot as a child. My whole childhood, I was like the kid that everyone hated at school. You always have those fantasies that you could have superpowers and just, you know, at the very least scare the crap out of everybody and put them in their place. And this movie does definitely fill that fantasy gap. The problem is, though, just the build up to it. And, you know, even though it's so heartbreaking, the prom scene is one of the most well done scenes in horror film history, because, you know, it's the way it would happen, where the guy who originally agrees to take Carrie to the prom as his date is no longer in on the joke. He doesn't know about the blood and everything, but he's genuinely actually seeing what a nice, sweet person she actually is, and he's actually falling for her and seeing her as a human being for the first time, and seeing that, you know, she's beautiful just like everyone else. And just the fact that when it happens, they pour the blood on her, which is teasing her for her period that she had. And, you know, she's been having, you know, problems with her periods in school. When that happens and she just snaps, and that's the last straw, embarrassed in front of the entire school, the faculty, everyone's laughing at her just like her mom said they would. She thinks everyone was in on it, and she doesn't care who's on what side. Doesn't matter who was nice to her. She just wants to kill everybody. And that is the way it would happen, is that the people who actually do care about you genuinely would be the ones who look like the a-holes and the ones who would get killed. So it's sort of like a realistic representation of how cruel irony like that works. Like, everything that happens in that movie is very believable, despite it being about a girl with psychic powers. They've made sequels and remakes up the ass, but there's really no reason to check out anything but the original. It is still worth watching. It holds up immensely. So here we are at the #1 film, my favorite Stephen King movie of all time. And even though I already did a version of this story, I am going with the 1990 made-for-TV 2-part miniseries of It. It's definitely not objectively the best made of any of the Stephen King films, but it is definitely my favorite. This is just something I saw at a very young age, and it's just always kind of been part of my life. And anytime I rewatch it, it still just gives me that special feeling. Like, it still just not only reminds me of being a kid, but you feel like you've lived the childhood of the main characters in the 1950s as you're watching it. Definitely part 1, like all versions of it, is much superior to part 2. I think the child actors are generally better than the adult actors. The kinship between them feels stronger. And there's just something about, I don't know what it is, the child part in it is always done better than the adult part. I guess part of it is just that adults going on a little kid adventure being scared by a clown isn't as convincing as defenseless little kids going out there. So yeah, it doesn't work as well, but it's not as bad as I think I originally said part 2 was. There's flaws, don't get me wrong, but I think it's not terrible. I think this movie, in a lot of ways, was a very surprising achievement for what they had, for the TV budget they had, the limitations of TV, that you couldn't show many things that were too gory or too scary or too explicit on TV. The time restraints, which I know is funny because it's like 4 hours long, but when you think about how insanely long the novel is, it's pretty impressive they were able to cut the fat that they did and still keep as much as they did. There's a lot of stuff in the book you don't need. There's a lot of stuff in the book I don't even want in a movie adaptation. And then there's stuff in the book you just could not put in a movie adaptation because someone would go to jail. But I think they did a really good job of cutting out what you don't need. There's a lot of things that they kind of boiled down, like the appalling character, Patrick Hockstetter from the book, is not really present in this movie. You hear his name as like one of the guys who was killed by it, but he's not really there. They have this guy Victor Chris as part of Henry Bowers' group now in the movie, who I believe was in the book, but he wasn't like a main character, major character, I should say. But yeah, they got rid of him because he's not really necessary. You don't need the disturbing story of Patrick Hockstetter in there. It's unsettling for no real reason. And much like the prom night thing, it just kind of hits the brakes and ruins the momentum of the story to a certain degree. There's a lot of stuff like that in this book. They simplified, they kind of like merged certain things together or reference it just in a line of dialogue and all, to let you know what happened. The only omission I would say that kind of sucked it's not there is we don't get a childhood scare for Mike Hanlon. In the book, it was the giant bird that chased him around. They reference that at the fortune cookie scene. There's like a bird fetus that he gets out of his fortune cookie that scares him. But we never actually see the scare. That's probably a combination of time restraints and budget restraints. They probably knew they couldn't do the bird and maybe just couldn't think of another scare, because many of them don't get their scares from the book. It's like a different scare made up for the movie, but they probably just couldn't think of anything for him, and time restraints were so tight that they already made Mike's flashback to childhood being him having to deal with Henry Bowers and running away from him, meeting the Losers Club, having the rock fight, and then officially starting and forming the Losers Club. So there was a lot going on in Mike's backstory already, his flashback, so I can see why they didn't want to do a Pennywise scare also. But I think this movie, the most important thing about it, the thing that I like the most about it, is I've gone on about this so much, but again, I think they really captured that, 1950s, 1960s time period, that Americana time period of, kids just playing in the woods and building dams together and going to the theater and everything, just doing all these little adventures in the woods, running from bullies, talking about their childhood fears and everything. Just that old 1950s child lifestyle is really well represented in this movie. And they really emphasize just how horrible their lives are outside of the Losers Club. But when the Losers Club is together, it's great. They're all super happy. Like, they're really like the family they all need, because, Beverly has a horrible home life and stuff. So like a lot of them have these horrible lives, and together they're much better. I will say, I think the new one emphasizes how bad all of their lives are more well than the 1991 did, because we don't really see what's like that bad about a lot of their other lives in the 1991, but you can just feel that camaraderie between them. Like, they're just such a cool group of friends. I remember watching the commentary on the DVD back in like 2009, and I remember them saying a lot of the actors were talking on the commentary just over the entire film. I remember a lot of them when they're all together in the woods, like, you know, saying they're gonna, you know, fight Pennywise together and all, like them saying like, damn, I wish I did stuff this cool with my friends when I was a kid. We would just get ice cream or something. It's like, yeah, you do feel that. You watch this movie and you wish you had their childhood. That's very important, I think, for a movie to make you connect with characters that much that you wish you were part of their world. And this movie does that really well, despite the horrible things they're going through. And just as I talked about how important the Losers Club was in the 2017 version, I also talked about how important Pennywise was. And Tim Curry is a very good Pennywise. I think one of the great things about his Pennywise is he works. Now, let me explain that. I don't mean he works at Dunkin' Donuts or something. I mean, like, the concept of him works. As great as Bill Skarsgård is, no kid in their right mind would go and talk to that clown. If you saw Bill Skarsgård's Pennywise in a sewer drain, you wouldn't even say hi. You would just freaking run. You would just be out of there. Whereas the whole point of Pennywise being a clown is to draw in children. A clown, you know, even though everyone's afraid of them now, back when the book was written, they were supposed to be synonymous with fun. Amusement parks, circuses, birthday parties. Clowns were the symbol of fun. But they were also always something that people were afraid of. It was a very common fear, a phobia of clowns. So he rode that line of like, you want to come and see me because I'm a clown, and that means that there's fun nearby. But at the same time, you're a little afraid, so he's already getting that little bit of fear out of you, which he lives off of. So it was the perfect combination of that, and also inspired by a lot of then recent stories like John Wayne Gacy. Real life horrors that were similar in some way. So Tim Curry's Pennywise being a funny guy and looking like, you know, bozo and just being a somewhat creepy but lovable clown to kids, and then being able to flip that and become really terrifying, I think works a lot better than Bill Skarsgård's clown that always looks like, you know, Count Orlok or Dracula from Nosferatu with clown makeup on. Like, he looks terrifying. But I will say, I never really found Tim Curry's clowns scary. I know a lot of people talk about how terrifying his Pennywise was, and I can see how he would have been, especially if you have a fear of clowns. But I never had a fear of clowns, and I just found him too damn funny. Like, he's just such a funny guy. There's so many times in that movie where he's being genuinely hilarious, and I remember as a kid just thinking he was so freaking funny. There's definitely some creepy scenes where he's changing into other things. I think like the skeleton coming out of the water of Ben's dad is probably one of the creepiest moments. The mummy coming down the staircase for Stan is also very creepy. And there's a lot of off-putting moments not with the clown, like when Stan commits suicide and that reveal. I remember that, like, it was actually at my brother's birthday party one year, a sleepover, and we were all watching. We all stumbled upon it when Richie is, you know, in the boiler room with the werewolf. And we just started watching it. We knew what it was. We just hadn't seen it yet. And when they got to that scene, everyone was laughing about it. I remember I was actually kind of creeped out by it, though, actually. I didn't find it as funny as everyone else did. But I think that the creepiest moment in the movie is the most effective scare is something so simple that the kids are in the sewer tracking down Pennywise. It's near the end of the first part, and there's a moment where he passes through, or I should say she passes through. In the book, its true form is actually female, but the true form of it, or the true Earth form of it, if you want to get technical, the true form is the Deadlights in the Macroverse. That's a totally different discussion. But the true form of it for this movie passes through pipes. There's an opening in a pipe. They all have to duck. and it glides over them. And we don't get to see what it is. We don't see that it's just a big cheesy claymation spider, which I know it wasn't actually clay, but you know what I mean. We don't see that. We just see this weird shape on its stomach and what is essentially the deadlights. But it's so dark and you can't quite see what you're looking at. You just see these strange lights hovering over them. And the way there's kind of that like eerie just like noise and that music is just kind of like, and you just see the kids kind of all looking up. You hear these weird noises of the lights and everything, and you see those passing over them. And the fact you barely see anything, you just see this weird abstract thing in the dark, it just makes your mind go crazy. Like, what am I looking at? Like, whoa, what did they just see? Like, what was that? And it's almost like this otherworldly moment where like the kids, like, yes, they're in the sewers under Derry, but it just like, it's just so creepy. It's so effective. I don't know. There's something about the way they did it that is so perfect. And, that part just always gets under my skin. And then when you actually see like, oh, it's just the stomach of a spider, it's nowhere near as scary. But I think that one moment is done really, really well. And that really, like, I think it would have helped to never actually see the true form of it. I know you have to physically kill it, but I think it would have helped to not see the physical form, because unfortunately I do think that all of that is ruined. I think fighting the clown in the sewer, but every now and then when you're in the sewers, you see these lights and stuff, and you see some vague hint of another form lying underneath, lying behind the clown. I think that's much scarier. Just the implication that this is not what it appears to be. But when you actually see what it's meant to be, and it's just a giant, animatronic spider, which is a very cool special effect. I'm not going to say it's not. It's just nowhere near as satisfying as what your imagination is going to make it. But regardless of that, regardless of the fact that the finale is a little underwhelming and all, I do just love this movie. I think the tone is perfect. The music choices are perfect. Everything in it is just so well done. It captures the time period so well, the innocence, but also the bravery of children, the camaraderie between children, the hardships of growing up as a child, especially one who is not popular. It just captures a lot of those things. Childhood fears, the fact that you can't talk about your childhood fears with adults, feeling like you're all alone, you're on your own, and no one else can help you but you and your friends. It's so good, and it really is like a perfect movie, even though it's very scary for children, mostly. I don't think it's a very scary movie for adults. I do think it's a great movie for children to watch, because I think kids will feel that relatability, and they'll feel that essence of fun between the friends and friendship with the characters. Almost like I said, as a kid you almost feel like you're friends with these characters as you're watching this movie. And while I do, I have said that the adult actors are not as good, and I don't like the adult versions of the characters as much, that's not to crap on them too hard. Obviously, the guy playing Richie's not going to be as naturally comedic as Seth Green even was when he was that young, but he still does a pretty good job, and I do like him quite a bit as an adult. I think a lot of them are likable as adults. John Ritter, he should have been the funny one, but he doesn't look anything like the kid who played Ben, but he's very good in the role. John Ritter was hilarious, and could just go watch Three's Company. But there was a good cast of actors, even if they looked nothing like the original ones. They were still very good actors. They still had that close camaraderie. I think it's not quite as close as when they were kids, but even though they look so drastically different, I feel like they have that same friendship they had as kids as adults, more than I do in the new one. In It Chapter 2, which came out in 2019, I feel like those adult actors they got just don't at all feel like the same people. And they don't feel like they have the friendship that they had when they were kids. It feels new. It feels different. Whereas I feel like in this one, it does feel the same. And a lot of that is probably due to the fact that we saw them as adults first. In the first segment, we see Mike Hanlon in the present day call each one and, inform them that it is back and remind them of the promise they made. And then we get the flashback of them as kids. So that definitely helps. I think the structure is better all around than the new one. But I just think everything is great in this movie. And yes, there are some parts that are really not scary at all. They're just goofy, but there's parts I think are scarier than in the book. I think when Beverly Marsh visits her childhood home in the movie, it's way scarier. In the book, it turns into like this ridiculous Hansel and Gretel thing where like the house is suddenly made out of chocolate and all this crap. And it's really not scary. And like the coffee turns in, or the tea or everything turns into feces. So like she's like drinking diarrhea. And it's like, that's not scary. That's just gross and stupid and funny. But in the movie, it turns into blood, which is more on point with the scare that she got as a kid. But then the makeup on the old lady, Mrs. Hirsch, when she suddenly starts to look like this zombified version of her father, is so disturbing in the movie. It's really creepy, and it's way scarier than that silly fairy tale crap that happens in the book. So, there's definitely a lot of times where I think, again, like Stephen King goes too big with his writing. The whole final act in the book, the battle is just so drawn out and over the top, and the whole town's crumbling and blowing up and everything, and it's this big cosmic ritual, the ritual of Chud, which is, it's cool. It definitely makes it feel like this is a real like, cosmic being you're fighting. This is not something you can just beat by throwing a rock at it, although in the movie they do that. But it's just so over the top in the book, and it's just overcompensating because, like they even joked in the Chapter 2 movie from 2019 with Stephen King in it playing, a pawn shop owner. They make the joke about him not knowing how to end a story. And I think he really doesn't know how to end a story. And I think the ending is much better in the movie than it is in the book. I don't think there's any, as much as I love the story of it, and it's just such a big story for me personally, I don't think there's a version of it that is perfect, and I don't think there's a version of it that really handles the ending well. I think the 1990 movie handles it the best of the three versions, but I don't think there's one that actually handles it great. I think it's a really good foundation, a really good build-up, a really good intro, a really good middle, but then I just feel like the end falls apart, and I don't know how I would do the story to fix that. I think it's you want to make it big and bombastic, but you don't want to go too big where you just kind of end up ruining it. So it's really hard to say what they should do with it. But I don't think any version of it has been perfect. But I think this 1990 version is as perfect as you can get. Obviously, there's a lot of personal bias there because I'm so nostalgic for this. And every year when I watch it, or every 2 years, whenever I watch it, it sucks me in again. And I care about these characters so much. And I love this movie so much. I love the score. The score is fantastic. Everything is good. I don't know. It's just really good. For the TV budget, the special effects are amazing. They're all practical effects. There's just some that, kind of blew my mind as a kid. I didn't even know how they did them. Now you know how they do stuff like getting Georgie to wink in the photo. But like back then, it's like when you saw stuff like that, it was like, oh wow, that's weird. It's a great movie. I think without a doubt, I wouldn't have to think twice. I'd just say this is my favorite Stephen King film. It's probably in my top 5 favorite horror films of all time. Do all the liking and subscribing and the sharing and the bell stuff.